All right, we are live. I am so excited to be here with Gregg Hurwitz, who is the New York Times #1 internationally best-selling author of 23 thrillers, including the Orphan X series. We are excited to do an AMA, and you all can ask Gregg anything. If you are joining us in Crowdcast, to the right of the chat is a little question box where you can add in your questions, and I will be Haley Desort. I know it says Dana on the little thing, but I am a marketing manager from Capability. I will be asking Gregg the questions for you all. And then this should also be streaming to Facebook, which I will be checking in a second. If so, if you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to join us in Crowdcast if you do want to ask any questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to be gathering any questions from Facebook, but you can watch there. So Gregg, I am going to check Facebook really quickly to make sure that it's streaming. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here with everyone. Thanks everyone for showing up.
So while I'm checking the Facebook live stream, why don't you start, before we jump into questions, telling everyone kind of like what you're working on, any cool projects that are coming up, other than, we have a new Orphan X book in the works.
Well, there's a new Orphan X that I have been polishing and tidying up quite a bit. So that's really fun. That's going to be out in February. One of the things that's really fun that started with the first book in this series is I started to write the whole thriller, and then the last chapter, I bring everything to a close and kind of turn over one more card of something that's sort of like a cliffhanger, but I always want to make sure that the book itself is satisfying and has come full circle. But I kind of intimate what might be coming next. And so there was a pretty big one at the end of The Last Orphan, and that's what we're teeing up in Lone Wolf now. That's what I've been roaring towards. A lot of the projects on the film and TV front are kind of frozen right now because of the writer's strike. So I would say, that smaller portion of me is on strike, but the main portion of me is here writing away on Orphan X. And I'm playing around thinking about maybe a short story. So that might be something that we talk about soon.
What is, would the short story be a Orphan X short story? Or are we thinking something separate?
Well, I like writing these short stories where it's an Orphan X short story and maybe some other characters too. So, I had one called The List that sort of starred Joey Morales. Joey's such a fun character to write for me. And so I was thinking, I was just wondering if anyone might be interested with a short story that has Evan Smoke and Joey Morales and Aragon Uria and maybe Candy McClure, who's Orphan V, and Tommy Stojak. We could get a whole kind of crew together and throw everybody at each other and see if anything combusts.
I really love that. I love the idea of the short story being able to be a container for you to kind of step outside what is happening in the series and kind of throwing the characters and just seeing what happens. So it looks like we are live on Facebook and everything's looking great. So we love when technology works. So just one more time, if you're joining us on Facebook and want to ask any questions, please join us in the Crowdcast. You can find the link in the Facebook event. And if you are just joining us now, I see some people jumping on. You can ask questions for Gregg on the right-hand side in the Q&A box, and I will be going through them. And if there's any that I find in the chat, I will try to grab them as well. But if you could just copy and paste them in the Q&A, just so everything's there. So our first question we have from Justin. He said, "Hi, Gregg, thank you for doing this. And more importantly, thank you for the Orphan X world. I was wondering how you created and settled on Orphanex 10 Commandments."
Oh, that's so interesting. So I started Orphan X. I was right on the cusp of turning 40. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because the series I start in a very unusual place. I started at a time where he's really shifting his worldview somewhat significantly. If you think about it logically, if I were to tell the story in linear fashion, we would pick him up as a foster kid in the foster home, right at the age of 12, taken out by Jack Johns. We would have his training. We would have all of his missions as Orphan X. We would have him leave the program. We would have him become the nowhere man. But that's not where I chose to start this series. I chose to start the series after all of that on the very first mission he takes, where basically he shatters every one of the 10 commandments. He's shattering out of the whole worldview that he had. It's a very unusual starting place. And what's been really fun about it, now that I've gotten to write, 9 books, is that it's given me a lot of room to fill in and to play. But I did know that this was going to be a different sort of series, a series about him sort of becoming, rather than a series that resets, where we get the same sort of book or story with the same character every time out. I wanted to start him chasing to reassemble himself with a new set of rules to live by. One of the things I say about him is he never learned how to speak the strange language of intimacy. Jack tells him the hard part won't be making you a killer. The hard part will be keeping you human. So I was kind of building these 10 commandments as I went. And I think I had the second first, which is how you do anything is how you do everything. That's probably the most popular. But I was sort of filling them in piecemeal as I wrote the books. I don't think all 10 of them appeared till maybe the 4th book. But what's interesting is when I go back and look at it, there is a sort of logic to the order, to the way that it just happened naturally, as if I thought it out better than I did.
That's quite amazing that it was falling in together. Our second question we have from Mark Williams. And so first, Mark just saying how you ignited his love of reading. But his question is, how fun is it when you're writing and out of nowhere comes Ida Rosenbaum? He's like a prank that Evan can't escape.
Oh, boy. With her blindingly strong violet perfume. One of the things that I wanted to do in this series is, one of the things that interests me a lot is the tension between perfection and intimacy. Evan can be perfect in a lot of ways, how he is performing and feeding himself and exercising and meditating and, fine tuning his body and his weaponry, if there's nobody else in his life, because intimacy brings complications. The minute you have a spouse or a kid or a dog or a friend or a maybe niece person in Joey, all of a sudden the complexities and mess of being human come in and interfere with everything. And Ida Rosenbaum for me was like the perfect person to indicate that. So when he comes in from some mission and he's being, threatened by gangsters. I think there's one that's where he's getting texts in from the Armenian mafia and they're saying, look, we're going to violate you so many ways. Like, you better check out a copy of the Kama Sutra for what's coming for you. And he's like in an HOA meeting and everyone's complaining about the olives that he's serving for snacks that he was supposed to bring. And so Ida Rosenbaum just flies in with her perspective, which is she's this elderly, educated, somewhat forward and difficult Jewish grandmother type. And every time he collides with her, like, she's tough as nails and she has her own agenda and she doesn't care if he's bleeding out from a knife bleed under his arm. She's going to get her way. And his having to slow and break out of the mode that he's in to sort of contend with that. There's a lot of opportunities for me, not just for humor in that, because those scenes can be pretty amusing, but also kind of poignancy. Like, there's a moment in one of the books where it's one of the first times he sees her as a real person, almost for the first time. He goes in to see her and she's been assaulted and she's kind of damaged and jewelry was stolen. And he sees her sitting there and she's got photographs of her husband. May he rest in peace, as she always says. And it's sort of him breaking through these shells that people have that make no sense to him to see the underlying humanity. And the more he can connect with that and understand aspects of that in himself, the more he can see it in other people. And so it's sort of comic relief and contrast at the same time. But then at different times, these characters will step out and offer something that puts him on his heels, right? Where he realizes he's been viewing them in a way that's pretty negative. So Ida Rosenbaum, she's on the case.
I love it. Our next question comes from Crystal Williamson. Curious why you chose Evan's early childhood to take place in a group home in Baltimore. Her ancestry traces back to those streets hundreds of years ago, and she loves him for it. So she said thank you.
Oh, that's great. So I know Baltimore a little bit. I did an internship, actually in dramaturgy of all things, over spring break one year when I was in college. I went down to Center Stage Theater. They have a wonderful repertory theater. They do a lot of really good work. So I was in Baltimore, kind of going around, going to Orioles game, and sort of getting to know the town. And then later in life, a little bit later, I met one of my really good friends who's a demolition breacher, maybe the preeminent demolition breacher in the world at the time. He'd come stay with me. He created the breaching license for LAPD. He'd be down and stay with me when he was, running breaching exercise in the hulls of 747s with, anti-terrorist task forces at LAX. He could get through anything. Brilliant guy, and just tough as hell. He looked like an inverted triangle of hammered steel. I mean, just like lats like this and handlebar mustache and just like the toughest looking guy you're ever going to meet. And he was so smart. And, he'd come out and stay with me, and we'd go out to some Hollywood party, and he'd be wearing like his T-shirt with the American flag and the talons of a bald eagle, like the big America shirt. And immediately there'd be all this overlap between him and people if I was crossing different types of demographics or different groups of friends, because if I had some sort of snooty friend who did a lot of travel, well, my buddy spoke a ton of languages from being a SEAL, right? And if somebody was a wildlife photographer, he knew all the lenses because he was training the Mujahideen against the Russians in early days. He's an older dude. And so there's all this great overlap, and I just admired him a lot. Actually, I went shooting with him at one time. He was like a plank holder for the SEAL Team 6 guys, where they had to redesign the barrels. I think it was Smith & Wesson 357s, because they fired so much ammo that the barrels were cracking, and they shot left-handed, right-handed. So shooting with him was like shooting with, it was like a carnival act at a Western. I mean, he could stop and strike a perfect pose and put 15, or 9 shots through a single hole at the dead center of the bullseye, like just slightly expanding it with every shot. And he was from East Baltimore, and he always talked about that he grew up, his parents were super broke, Irish, and he grew up in like a Black and Hispanic part of town, like tough part of town in East Baltimore. And so he not only fought all the time, but all of his friends were also Black and brown and whatever it was. It was the mix. So he was like an outsider, but he was also an insider within that. And for me, I thought it'd be so interesting to have Evan, who's this white kid who grew up. There's a line in a book that I'm still coming to that's not going to be out yet, where he's starting to get challenged about different things. And he says, who do you think my brothers were in the foster home? Right? It was urban communities a little bit more than the rural communities that Tommy's from, right? All these characters are from these different ecosystems. And so in a way, it's an easier bridge for him to be, tight with Joey, because her sort of slang and her street style that she gets into matches a lot of hands. And so he's really comfortable in urban settings. He's really comfortable with people from all different cultures. And that piece of it fits in different cultures, different races, with some of the training he has with Jack that put down a sort of like the linguistic or the etiquette exchange that has to go on top of his sort of street knowledge of growing up in a pretty tough East Coast city.
I really like thinking about like the way that Evan is like integrated with some of these other characters. And kind of speaking of Joey, we have a question from Alex Crowe asking, will Joey get another standalone book, or will we get official art for these characters?
Official what for these characters?
Art.
Huh. So Joey has not had her own standalone book, but she has certainly had a short story that she's prominent in. I think that's coming again soon. I think Joey is proving to play a bigger and bigger role. I have a bit of a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read past or read Hellbent, but I was planning to kill Josephine Morales at the end of Hellbent. And if you go back and look at it, you can see exactly the scene where she is bleeding out and she was supposed to die. And she grew on me so much in writing her. Her voice was right there for me in my head. And her interaction and engagement with Evan so dimensionalized him and brought out all these facets in him. And so much of him and some of the care and tenderness that he was feeling is very different with her, even than with Mia, right? Or with other adult relationships he's had, because in a way she's sort of like his charge. And she was the last thing he wanted in Hellbent. He wanted to go on a straight, like, man on fire revenge mission to get after everybody who went after Jack. And here he is saddled with the most inconvenient thing in the world that proves to be a sort of light guiding his way towards a sort of salvation, towards a better understanding of that strange language of intimacy that he doesn't speak. So it's very funny because I got to the end of that and I was like, I can't not have this kid in the mix. And I'd say over the book, she's pretty much become the number 2, which is bizarre because I never would have thought it would be, a 16, now 17-year-old hacker girl who talks in my ear and I can type it.
Well, I think Rob Ziegler's question pairs perfectly with this this question of Joey, and he asked, when structuring a book, how much is thoroughly mapped out and how much is just sitting and writing and have creativity flow?
Man, it's always a dance between the two. I mean, I leave a lot more room now for new ideas to leak in. I've talked before that I write using what I call a rolling outline. I have a big wide monitor. That's what I'm looking at y'all on right now. It's big enough for 2 big Word documents side by side. And one of them is filled with, usually when I start, 16 to 20 pages of bullet points. It's snippets of scenes, it's ideas, it's research, it's lines of dialogue. It's just stuff about the book, the roughest shape of it. And that outline, as I'm writing right now, it's still expanding. I'm working on, partially working on a new book, and it gets bigger and bigger. And then it starts to shrink as I incorporate it into the book, right? Because, I'll cut and paste. But what that living, breathing outline is if I get in a scene, let's say I get into an HOA scene, and there's something funny that happens that could be a dropped handkerchief for a later action, right? Or something that comes around in a poignant way later, I can just put that right into the outline and adjust it and go back in the script, in the manuscript, or forward in the manuscript. And so basically they're both always evolving, and I'm getting a lot better at, the proverbial killing of the babies. Is there a scene that doesn't work? Is there an approach that doesn't work? I have a bunch of notes in an outline, all of which are too abstract, but they'll get me to the right place on the day. So I leave a lot of room for improvisation and for opportunities and for switching tracks and to having it be a process of discovery. Because if I'm discovering it when I'm writing, it's a lot more fun for how that dance works with the reader.
Well, and kind of when you're thinking about this process of discovery, one of the questions being asked from an anonymous person, they had mentioned that one of the things they appreciate most about your writing is the level of granularity you provide. They mentioned that it must be challenging with a character like Evan Smoke, whose first 3 commandments are all reinforce extreme attention to detail. What is your research process like writing for a character who almost never misses a detail? And how do you make sure all the specs on the F-150 make logistical sense? How do you check your blind spots? So I think that's really interesting when you're talking about this kind of openness, but then also so much of your characters and what you're having to do is very detail oriented.
Well, it's funny because my process writing, or my experience living as a writer who's always, I think it was Lawrence Kasdan who said, being a writer is like having homework every day for the rest of your life, right? So anywhere I'm going, I have a notepad, or I'm dictating, or I have bits or pieces of something. And so I'm always paying attention to details. I'm always thinking about different things. And then I have to make sure that I have them right. I have a lot of subject matter experts. I was just on the phone today with a friend who's a former SEAL, having him relive. He told me, like, there was this one just like harrowing experience he went through during Buds Week. And it's always been in the back of my head that I want to use it. And I just called him today. I'm like, give me all the details. Like, what was it like? Where were you? How long was the swim? What was this like? What's the piece? What's the spec on that? And then I just have individual experts too. Like, you're asking about the truck. I flew out. I had a buddy whose name was Billy Stojak, who Tommy Stojak's based on. He's passed away since, but he basically was Tommy Stojak. He was this amazing character. And I used to fly out and visit him in Vegas, and we'd just shoot every kind of gun, and he'd take me through, his truck and the way you armor up a truck. And we had all the stuff I could do firsthand. And then I could call him. And now I have an expert he's like a trainer in 12 different categories for the NRA. Very interesting, Japanese American, meticulous detail to, gunsmithing and armory, and, can get me anywhere. If I'm talking about a kind of ammo, he can call the ammo companies. So I want to get that right, but I also don't want to like bludgeon people over the head with, for instance, like weapons porn, right? I'm not writing a book that's primarily a military tech and guns thriller. Like, my mom reads the series. I have a lot of teenage readers. Like, a lot of people are reading the series for different reasons. And so the hope is to bring everything, whether it's psyops, whether it's vodka, whether it's the knives that he's fighting with, right? Whether it's the mindful awareness meditation that he's working with, to try to bring it in a way that the reader feels like it's something almost that they're experiencing and can engage with, not that it's just a wall of tech terms and specs, because, at the end of the day, who gives a shit?
Well, it sounds like a lot of your readers also love all of those details, but I like that, not so always heavy-handed. Another
well,
question.
They have to be, I would say they have to be deployed in the scene, or they have to be reflective of character. And so if you do it, it's really cool, because a gun person will be like, man, like you nailed that one thing. But if you're not, you can see it in how that reflects back on Evan, right? Even if you don't know any more about it than what kind of olives he's using for his martinis. So if I can embed all the details in a way where they're shining like a mirror onto character or the scene, then that way, I hope I get to have all sorts of details and different expertise reflected without people getting bored by it.
That's amazing. So with that being said, as you're making your way through all of these novels, another question from Rob is, how do you keep it fresh when, instead of writing, 25 to 30 books of the same character doing the same things and structured the same ways, how do you make it different each and every time?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. I would say that it used to be that when I started, I would just pursue areas of interest. Like, I wrote a book about mind control cults because I got like fascinated with mind control cults. I wrote a book that takes place in Galapagos that deals with evolutionary biology and like lava flow. And I went and did all this research. But increasingly what it is, and I think what makes Orphan X a very different series for me, is it's a lot of how I keep myself and my life and my own perspective fresh. Like, I'm trying to sort of grow and think about story and narrative and relationships and insight and, discipline and ritual in ways constantly in my own life. And as I discover new things, I can write and have Evan bring them further along. And sometimes he's further along than me, because, another favorite quotation I have about writing is Joan Didion, who said, "I write so I know what I think." And that's true for me also. Like, there's times I'll be working out something and then I'll realize I'm working out something through Evan that, of course, in a reflected or larger way, often in the books, is some kind of knot that I'm tangling with within my own life. And so, it's constant exposure to different types of people and different types of ideas. I have a lot of friends from all sorts of different communities representing all sorts of different belief structures, all sorts of different lifestyles, all sorts of different political affiliations or ideologies, and moving between them and watching how they observe and where they're coming from, for me, allows a sort of freshness as Evan opens up and becomes having more of an understanding of what it means to be human, as other people who he can recognize as human, whether it's either Rosenbaum or Josephine Morales or Hugh Walters, the infuriating HOA president, they can shine if he recognizes them. And if I'm writing them from a fresh perspective, because I'm learning and engaging with them, people in my own life, that will chisel away and give him new challenges and give him new structures and give him more moral and ethical impediments. And that's sort of what the process is to bring more people, more characters who are fully rounded in my head into interaction and engagement with him. And that's what I try and do in my own life, to be honest.
Our next question comes from Sarah Bacon. The opening scene of one of of one book has Evan making his bed with his boots on, which obviously leads to a saga of events when the magnetic bed takes his boots off and he subsequently has to go down to get something from his truck. This scene has always nagged at me as being extremely out of character for him and his meticulousness, and I would love to hear what your thoughts were in creating this scene.
Oh, okay. So, look, Evan has his boots on when he's training in his house. And this is the first time. So, even Orphan X makes mistakes. And one of the things I never want to write is a character that, as much as he's always aiming for perfection and striving for perfection, I don't want to write a character who is perfect, because that's dull and it's not relatable. There's not enough to do with that. So he makes mistakes. He gets short-tempered with Joey and will say something that's damaging to her. He can have lapses at times. And, this is evidenced by the fact that he's surrounded with a bunch of people who are all better within their field than he is within that field. I mean, Tommy's a better shot, and Joey's a better hacker, and Melinda is a better counterfeiter and papers expert. And Evan's sort of the assimilating center, that he takes everything in, but it takes the totality of who he is as being this sort of present person who observes everything, but somehow recedes. He's just an ordinary guy, not too handsome, as I say in every book. And so there's one time he's training, up in his penthouse condo, and he started to make his bed with his boots on, and the steel shank in his boot got sucked into the magnetic field of the bed, and it slammed him down on his back. And for me, that was a moment to have some comedy, because that's the precise moment that his roam zone rings. And so flat on his back with the wind knocked out of him, he has to answer in a much more humiliating posture and say, "Do you need my help?" And that, I believe that's the 5th book. So I established the trope enough that it's time for me to start to play with it and to have that be fun. The way that Joey will start to play with that and take that apart. It's a process of him being and becoming more human in certain ways. And so that was the thinking that went into that scene.
So this kind of goes back to a little bit of the mapping out, but from Alex, he was wondering if you have an idea for the end of Evan's story. Also, his middle name is Evan, and he enjoys sharing a name with such a cool character.
Naming a character like Evan, it's funny because it's like when you name your kid, you have to go through the list, and your spouse will be like, "Oh no, you can't name, you can't name him, we can't name her Brunhilde. There was a Brunhilde in my elementary school who was a terrible bully." It's the association game. And so I agree that Evan's a cool name, because I had only very positive associations with Evans, or else I couldn't have married him. I couldn't have been married to him for an entire series of books. And, it is a marriage of sorts, given that I spend more waking hours with him probably than I do with my wife and kids, because that's the bulk of my waking hours. So the middle name we started on first. The question before was, remind me.
Do you have an idea of his story's end?
I have an idea of what's going to happen at the end of book 10 that will be tectonically shifting. That's not going to be the end. That's not going to be the end of everything for me, but I do think there's going to be something of an arc of those that I'm pretty clear on. And then we'll begin another one.
So exciting.
I'm not quite at the end of everything yet of what's going to happen with him.
So this seems like a fun question and a kind of a personal one from Bo. Why was Canada, your freshman dorm, the best freshman dorm ever? And how would Orphan X penetrate its student protest-proof design?
All right, so that's a college joke right there. Yeah, I went to a school that was somewhat historic and beautiful in its architecture, and I managed to live in the least historic and beautiful buildings the entirety of the way through my college. And so Canada was one of them. It looks like it was designed by the committee of ducting from the Soviet Union or something. It just was it was a pretty ugly concrete structure. We might have built, using a pocket knife, an entire second floor. We were on the top floor and had like a loft space and had 2 beams on the side. And we actually built and put plywood up with 2 beds up there and made a second story, which is something I doubt would be allowed today. So I don't know. It's a pretty tough facility to penetrate. A lot of stairwells, stairwells and hallways that are fatal funnels, and not an elevator to be had. So it's pretty impressive, but he could get in there. Think when he pulled off and into the fire, he got in and out of some pretty tight, impossible places. So I think perhaps even Canada might not be sufficient to deter him.
I love it. We have a really fun question from Michael Feldman. Great writers such as you credit the support of people around them for their success. You have acknowledged many people at the end of each book, both a changing cast of characters and many who are reoccurring fixtures, e.g. Dana, Jeff, Philip, Melissa. Who makes up your core writing team, and what ways do those various people help elevate your work?
That's a good question. Man, a lot of people. Getting a book out into the world takes a lot of people. So the writing part of it, let's just say that's research. So my sister is an MD. I'm from a family of doctors. And one of my college roommates, Brett Nelson, is an ER physician. And that's incredibly useful because he can help me injure people with great precision. I mean, I basically call him just to violate his Hippocratic oath at all times. So he'll be in the middle of a meeting and I'll be like, I need to stab somebody through 2 ribs precisely that hit key organs so that they can bleed out in 7 minutes. Like, what do you got for me? And so he can just work with me all the time. My sister is a rabid reader, so she's there too. Jeff Baer, who I think numerous times, he's the former CTO of Sun Microsystems. He's just a brilliant kind of Silicon Valley software engineer and venture capitalist. And I use a guy called Borsky now, Michael Borhovsky, who's a wonderful hacker in spirit. And so I have my subject matter experts, and then Philip Eisner. Philip is Philip Eisner, who he mentions. And Philip, for instance, is a longtime friend. We got thrown together, 15 years ago, maybe, on a rewrite of the sequel to the remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, the Pierce Brosnan. And there was a big round table, and Philip and I got put together because we had different ideas for the heist. A Thomas Crown Affair heist, it's got its own aesthetic. Every action character or show or franchise, it needs to have its own version of characters. Like a Jack Reacher fight isn't the same as a Bourne fight, right? Isn't the same as a Bond action sequence. They all are different. So we were thrown together working on that. And years later, we've co-written a few screenplays together, including a movie called Sweet Girl that came out, I think maybe 2 to 3 years ago now, starring Jason Momoa. And Philip, for the last, 15 years, let's call it, has just been one of my first readers. I'm one of his first readers on the screenplay front also, and then we also write together. So he's just a trusted eye. I have wonderful, wonderful editors, and I have a wonderful agent in Lisa Erbach Vance. I have a spectacular agent. She's got a great eye. She's a marvel, and so she's very trusted. And then I have a wonderful editor at Macmillan in the U.S. at Minotaur, Keith Kayla, and in the U.K. it's Roland White, and a agent with brain power all day, whose name is Caspian Dennis. In fact, it's Caspian's birthday today. And so I have also a core team within the progression through the business aspect of publishing that also are really great at figuring out, covering more blind spots. Do I need to cut something down? Is this part too long-winded? And everybody in my circle tends to be fairly direct, unabashed, at times blunt. It's a lot like Evan when he's interacting with his different people. I don't want to say like a rough and tumble creative style, but I don't tend to work with or around people who don't tell me precisely what they're thinking and what is wrong and what could be better.
I love it. And then, love knowing all of those people on your team. And this question's from Jody Meeks. If your books were made into a movie or a series on a streaming service, who would you want to play Evan, and who would you want to play the other characters?
So here's what's very challenging with that. The one time that I made like a submission only to an actor was about a year before Orphan X came out, and we sent it only to Bradley Cooper. And in fact, I adapted it for him, but he didn't end up doing it. He moved on to do A Star Is Born, which was spectacular. But for him, I kind of thought the range of the humanity from Silver Linings Playbook to the badassness of American Sniper. And that was a while ago. I mean, that was a year before Orphan X came out, and we're looking now at the 9th book. So looking at this now, the better part of a decade later, I think what might be really interesting is somebody who's either very surprising, a character who we're seeing in a new light, the way that we saw Bryan Cranston in Breaking Bad, when he was sort of the dad from Malcolm in the Middle, right? Or Will Smith in Independence Day, where he was a sitcom kid. And I still remember being in the theater, and there's that first scene that he has his shirt off and he's pulling an alien across the desert. And like half of the women in the theater just like shrieked. It was like this new version of somebody who we had seen and were familiar with. And I think that could be really interesting if it's somebody who's unpredictable. And the other thing that I like a lot is somebody who is relatively unknown. Like, I think the casting was very good for the streaming, for the Reacher TV show, for instance, and in a way it's fitting the character very well. And he's not somebody who brings in a pre-existing awareness around him, because Evan's not like the flashiest, best looking, smoothest guy where you can start thinking, okay, is that Daniel Craig? Is it Sean Connery? Is it Roger Moore? Could it be Idris Elba? Could it be Clive Owen? There's a sort of type to it. And part of what what a key aspect of Evan is that he's utterly forgettable, like his Ford F-150. I always say average size, average build, just an ordinary guy, not too handsome. And of course, whoever we cast will be better looking, but he's average in so many ways. And so I think that how we cast that could be interesting and different.
I love that. I love the just remarkably forgettable in some ways.
Evan, in a lot of ways, just real quick, Evan, in a lot of ways, is based on me. So my wife is tiny. She's like 5 foot, like straining to get to 5'1". And she's always infuriated because if she goes to buy shoes, like she has these little tiny feet that are so small, I don't know how she actually can stay vertical, that she doesn't just topple everywhere like a Bobo doll. And so, it's ridiculous. It looks like she wears doll clothes half the time. And I can get any shirt off any rack. Like my shoe size is dead average. Like everything about my size and build is completely average in a way that was like a source of amused frustration or irritation to her. And so Evan's based in a lot of ways on me that way, of just this like very ordinary bearing and appearance. He's a guy that everything fits. He's a guy that you might look past.
I love that. I don't know that you're a guy that people would just look past, Greg, but
Well, I'm saying I could buy a suit off a rack. I could buy, I could wear what the mannequin wears in the window at the Gap. Yeah. I could fit anywhere, and Jack Reacher couldn't, and Bond couldn't. Bond's got to be bespoke. He's got to be pretty fucking dashing, so.
This next question is from Dan. Would you ever consider a small cameo from Mitch Rapp, Scott Harvath, or James Reese?
Look, I mean, wonderful characters from wonderful authors. There's a lot of kind of legal static around doing something like that, because you're dealing with other people's characters and you're dealing with their publisher, and but if there's if something fun came up with somebody who's a close friend of mine in the writing community, it's not something I'd be opposed to, or maybe in like a short story format in a crossover or something like that. It's not something I'd rule out.
From Kathy Jarman, she said that she was introduced to your work after watching your contributions on the Exodus series. From Exodus to Orphan X, can you share some thoughts about your experience with that round table?
Wow. That table was a pretty amazing experience for me. I did a seminar, it's 32 hours long, if you can believe it, about the book of Exodus. And I was there as a sort of narrative expert. There were theologians from Cambridge there were, Orthodox icon carvers, psychologists, lawyers, evangelical intellectuals. And so I was very much, I love being at tables and in communities where I have a lot to learn, where I'm not the most obvious person to participate in them. I tend to move among communities like that. And it was amazing to be there and to really break down and to go through and read Exodus in that sort of depth to understand what it's getting at and what it's dealing with psychologically and how it's looking to orient, people across a culture and then vertically up Mount Sinai. And we talked a lot about the relationship to the fringe of a culture to the center of a culture, and what's necessary to define a center, and what makes the center hold, and how do you still have dignity and respect and rights for people on the fringe, and how is that actually reflected in Exodus in ways that might be surprising. So it was a pretty mind-blowing experience for me. It made me reconsider a lot of notions that I had. One of them particularly about the necessity, this relationship of the fringe and the center. Another one was the necessity for governance that's broken up and then is localized in a certain way rather than merely being from the top down, but the ways that responsibility has to be distributed. And I think it gets at the heart of one of the biggest conflicts, as I see it, within the Orphan X series, which is the conflict between Evan Smoke and Luke Devine. Luke Devine is a brilliant, pretty clearly bipolar or at least manic power player, a power broker. He's got a lot of manipulation at his disposal and a lot of power. He's got a black book. He's got a lot of extortion. He throws these giant Great Gatsby parties in the Hamptons, and he puts every sin on display for people who come. Beautiful young men and women, drugs, alcohol, everything's right there. And he just lets everybody partake, but he's got hidden cameras all through the house. And so he's amassed this incredible leverage to be a power player. And his argument to Evan in The Last Orphan is that he's just doing up here what Evan does on the street level. But Evan has a very natural disdain's maybe not the right word, hesitation or hesitancy about engaging with things that are either too abstract or too intellectual or too ideological in a way. He prefers things if they're boiled down in concrete, right? If one young man is killed, if one young woman is killed, right? That's where he will put his focus. And Luke Devine is up, in a way he represents Milton's Lucifer from Paradise Lost. He's the intellect that falls in love with itself and believes that it can solve all things. And so Exodus, in a way, deals with that tempering between the physical and what's in front of you, the ritual that you maintain to hold any practice, right? And how you align that up to something that's abstract without getting lost or feeling vertiginous or dizzy in the abstraction of it.
What a fascinating, that was such a good question. And also
a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. Richard asked, what kind of stepdad would Evan be to Peter?
Stepdad implies, I think, a level of consistency and availability that he's just not capable of without putting somebody at risk. I mean, he's very, very fond of Peter. Like, he adores that kid much more than he'll admit. And I think Peter has a lot of reflections of him as a young man. He's an orphan of sorts, and that his dad died when he was young, though of course he still has Mia, his mom, raising him. But I think Evan sees in him a sort of like spirit. Peter's a sensitive kid, but he's actually being raised properly. He's being raised with rules for life that make sense if you want to raise a functioning, healthy, connected, emotionally aware member of a community and a family. It's the opposite of how Evan was raised. And so I think he sees in Peter a lot of things that he himself could never be. But he and Peter have a great relationship. Like, at one point, when Mia's down and out really hard for an injury, she has this kind of brain bleed and they don't know what's going to happen with her. Peter's kind of looking at him saying, is mom going to die? And Evan's like, I don't know. Whatever is going to happen, we're going to deal with it. Like, he doesn't talk to him as a child. He doesn't talk to him and put on kind of false airs or nonsense. And so there's such a pureness in kids. they're so spectacularly connected with their id, and yet their id is connected to sort of higher, more graceful orientation towards the world of like wonderment and curiosity. And, they tend to be, even if they act mean, there tends to be like a quick access to a heart beneath it. Kids are just so wonderfully pure in so many ways. And so I think there's a wistfulness in Evan's engagements with him, and a bit of a melancholy for him to see this child who he wants to help to flourish and to be there, that he can't ever be there fully for, but he's growing up into being a young man, like a young man that Evan could never be himself. These are very good questions, by the way, people.
Really great. This question's from Mark Williams. As an author, have you ever dealt with imposter syndrome? If so, how did you overcome it?
I think everybody has some aspect of that. And I think for me, I don't have that as like a key resting place. Look, I've been doing this a long time, fortunately, I mean, I started really, really young. In some ways, I think I had the protection of the bullheadedness of youth going in. I started The Tower, my first book, when I was 19 years old. And I was just like, look, if I write a good book, someone will buy it. Like, I had no idea how hard it was, right? I just grew up obsessively reading. I wasn't allowed to watch TV growing up. I mean, I rode to the library. I read the entire young adult section by 5th grade. I was reading Stephen King. I was always in bookstores. And I just approached it with the sort of exuberance and stubbornness and probably arrogance of youth, of just like, if I do this and do this well, I got to have a shot at it, right? Pre-internet, so I couldn't see any of the statistics that, your odds are terrible and, the path is long and hard. And then I had a decent amount of trouble selling my second book. I think I had 35 rejections straight. And then the 36th person opened a new imprint, and we resubmitted it and they bought it. It was really hard. And so I got hit pretty hard in that second book phase where I was like, oh, I thought I sold a book. Somebody remarked, and I forget who, it might've been Laura Littman, it might've been Zoe Sharp, or it might've been quoted by those two wonderful writers. But somebody said, when I sold my first book, I thought I won the lottery. And then I realized I won a lottery ticket. That's a bit how it is, where it's like, woohoo, you're like, I should go in. I've made it now. It's like, And I've written long enough now that part of that's in my wiring, right? And so I think in a way you learn a kind of confidence that's different from arrogance, just from the muscle memory. I learn when I get stuck to not go down that not to give it too much weight, to go for a swim, to get a night's sleep, to wake up, go for a walk, wrestle with the dogs, and reapproach. And so, if a number of terrible pieces of news or things come in a certain way, I think we're all vulnerable to that, certainly. But it's important when you're writing that you give yourself the space and the respect to take care of yourself as a writer who's writing. Like, you don't need you sitting there telling you that you're an imposter, so the voice in your head should be, it can be a taskmaster. It needs to be for me. It can't be yet, at least so far. But, if there's a engaged coach in a lot of ways who's not, being overly hard on yourself is not a good middle long-term strategy. It just isn't. And so I think if you're sitting there, and I mean, I'm gleaning from the question that perhaps it's something that some of you grapple with from time to time. I mean, think about if you're getting imposter syndrome and your head's getting loud and it's not being nice, if you could take those thoughts out and sit them on a couch next to you and listen to them, is that a friend you'd want to listen to? If they're like, you're a joke, you're never going to be good, this isn't, what are you even doing? You can't do this. It's like, you don't need that in your head. What in your head is, you can figure out how to do this. You're sitting here writing. Writing is progress, not perfection. It's an art form that you can never get all the way right. Have you put together 2 hours today? Have you put together 8 hours this week? How's this week look like last week? Okay, was there a stumble because personal stuff came up? How are you going to set it to do it next week? You need to have some encouragement, and you need to have some gentleness as your internal narrator in some ways. And I mean, that's something I wish I had more of when I was younger. But I think that's part of what goes hand in hand with trying to dispel of an imposter syndrome is if you can be kind to yourself. Kind's overrated. I mean, if you can not narrowed the scope of your possibilities to perform and to do things differently in a way that you can view yourself with more respect. That's really what it's about. If things are bad, okay, what are you going to do about it? Have you not written for 2 weeks and maybe you think you're full of shit? Okay. Either writing might not be for you, or what's your way back into it that you can look at, and what are some targets you can set that you can start to hit again to recognize. It's like getting back in shape. It's working out a muscle.
I really, really love that advice, Gregg.
Thank you.
From Justin, can we look forward to more waxing philosophic moments between Evan and Ergonuria moving forward? Their storyline relationship has been one of my favorite developments.
Oh, that's terrific. I loved writing and creating Ergonuria. He was amazing. And I think he like blew into the series. I mean, really, one of the things I wasn't thinking about, so often I realize what I'm writing about a little bit once I start to get into it. And I knew always I was going to have Evan have a mission. This is in Dark Horse with somebody who's a pretty complicated, capable of incredible violence human being, much like Evan, right? But somebody whose heart was fundamentally really good in certain ways, and who has a internal code that's locked, who's like a loving and connected nephew to his aunt who lives with him, and husband to his wife, and father to his daughter, and patron to the community. And really, when I go back and look at that, I think, well, if Evan has a friend, if the Curious George title of the book is Evan Smoke Makes a Friend, what would a friend look like? What would somebody who Evan Smoke would be friends with look like? In a lot of ways, it would look like Ergonuria. He's a mirror to him in so many ways. He's very comfortable in his warmth, in his spirit, in his heart, in his affections. And he's also capable of, running essentially a cartel 2.0 just outside the rules of international engagement and going up against other cartel members. But he feels very, very deeply. And intimacy for him it's at the core of who he is. And so it makes for this wonderful contrast, the dance between the two of them. And I've loved writing him. He's been a huge addition to the kind of rogues gallery.
So we're coming up on an hour. So I'm going to take just a few more questions. Unfortunately, we have a lot more questions coming in. If anyone who's watching and is in Crowdcast and in the chat, if you see any questions on within the question boxes, everyone can vote to push them up if there are a few that people are seeing that they really want to know the answer to. Another question from Rob, do you ever think of a Candy story or series that would be co-written with a female author?
Not right now. I have too many plans for Candy in my head still. So I'm not feeling an inclination to share her at the moment with anyone but Evan. But there's going to be more from her.
Another from Jody. The first book she read that you wrote was Don't Look Back. That book was fabulous and completely terrifying. Where did you come up with that story idea?
That's interesting. So I love jungles. I don't know why. I don't love camping. I don't love a lot of things that are outdoorsy, but I love jungles. I've gone way into the remote Amazon. I spent a lot of time in the Scalesia forests in the highlands of Galapagos. My second book takes place there. And I love that mood between kind of predator and alien, like that sort of horror sense. My second book really hits on that hard. And I knew that I wanted to go back to the jungle with a story. And I wanted to tell the story. I wanted to have a female character I wrote a series of books that were all sort of Hitchcock standalone everyman thrillers. And I wanted to write one about a woman. And I wanted to write about a woman who'd lost her voice, essentially, in her life, in her marriage. She'd lost her version of herself. And she winds up being a single mother. I knew the opening scene right away. The opening scene is her on the phone with her husband, having a conversation where she says, where basically she's learning that he had an affair, and the conversation, you catch up to it as she does, where she goes, wait, how many times? Where was it? In a hotel? Was it ever in the house? 7 times or 6? Who is she? And so it opens with her world blowing up. And essentially, you know, she realizes how far she's gotten from herself. She has a lot of things she thinks that she can't express in the world. And she and her husband were supposed to go to this eco lodge in the middle of the jungles in Oaxaca, Mexico, for their anniversary. And she shows up to that anniversary. They have a little anniversary thing waiting for her, which is embarrassing. But she shows up alone to rediscover herself. And then she sees a very bad, scary man in the jungle. And she sees something she shouldn't see. And there's a mystery that's happening at the same time that a giant storm kind of blows through and wipes out the comms. And it becomes like 10 little Indians. And it was just one of these stories that came to me fairly fully formed. And I was looking around at where to go, and I settled on Oaxaca. I made a very, very dear friend out of that trip. I flew down, met a friend of a friend, and we went and did everything. I mean, I hiked, I did class 4 whitewater rafting through the jungles. I went on horseback riding across the beaches. We went up and did hiking up to like coffee plantations. I mean, we just did everything. And it was amazing. I just immersed myself in the jungle for you know, a stretch of time, and then came back and wrote this book. And it was one of those weird stories that had all the pieces. That one never got messy for me. A lot of books get messy in the middle where I'm like, oh, is this working? Is it getting too bloated? Is it fat? Is there too many pieces? And that one just was snapped together. There's a few books that come that way.
So I think we have our last 2 questions here. You balance crafting dark, high-octane thrillers with making a real difference in the world, both through your writing, contributing philosophical pieces to publications like The Guardian, HuffPost, and The Bulwark, as well as through your actions, educating public servants on messaging with the purpose of averting real existential threats, in contrast to Evan's dispatching fictional villains. How do you switch between those different creative modes? And more importantly, what kind of legacy would you like to leave? And that one is from Michael. Really
Boy, that's a good question. That is one of the biggest challenges that I am dealing with, is how to kind of lane change between things that are that sort of significant or that real world. I think I finally got a handle on it. I mean, I used to switch from, you know, novels were always the spine of my career, my first love, but I could switch into a script. I could switch into TV. I could switch into comics. Once some of the political work came, and a lot of the work that I have is on depolarization, right? And trying to work against the dehumanization of the other side, whatever that might be for you. If in fact that's the context in which you view things, because the dehumanization is what leads and drives further polarization, in the sense that, like, well, we have to do something. We have to break more rules over here to possibly keep up with them, because everything's really their fault. There's a whole process that kind of goes through that. And my encounter with some of the work that I did in politics and the culture and in different communities is sort of an expansion of kind of who I've always been. I've always had friends ranging 360 degrees around the ideological sphere. And the further I went into it, and the more that I saw the workings of that and the problems, it turns out that that's deeply, deeply informing for me of my writing and what I'm trying to get at with Evan, and what I'm trying to get at with this robust and varied set of characters. You know, Tommy Stojak's a long ways from Joey Morales, is a long ways from Melinda, is a long ways from Mia, right? Is a long ways from Jack Johns. There's all sorts of characters from all different sorts of viewpoints. And my hope is that none of them are straw men or strong women, that they're all either rounded, or as Evan finds greater depth within himself, he discovers and allows room for them to become more rounded. And in a lot of ways, I think my legacy that I would hope to have in some ways is to help reorient people, America first in some regards, but the world, and in the world of my stories, to reorient people towards a narrative that feels unifying, that feels like it sort of is foundational and mythic again, where we can have all sorts of differences. We can have all sorts of different personalities. We can have all kinds of big and wild and dangerous and gentle and kind and good influences and instincts within the mess that we all are as humans. but there's a way that they can operate in concert, and that we can move away from chaos into order, and to reach back to the earlier question about Exodus. One of the key things that was the biggest upshot in a lot of ways with the story of Exodus that I thought about a lot during that time was from tyranny, not to the promised land. When you leave tyranny, you go straight out into the desert and you're wandering, and right? Whether it's a political ideology, whether it's an addiction, whether it's a relationship that's wrong, in a way, you're leaving a kind of tyranny that you've participated in. And the first thing that happens is your worldview disintegrates. It's not that you walk out of that into, you don't leave an abusive relationship and dance right into a super stable, right, marriage and 4 kids. There's therapy, there's breakdown, there's reconstituting yourself, there's chaos. Likewise with addiction, likewise with almost anything. It's almost this it's like this micro system that's looping. And I think for me, a lot of what the books are about is how we reorient through ritual and excellence and depth. How do we reorient towards truth and meaning in our lives? How do we find and engage in that painful process that is still, I think, clearly worth it? How can we engage in a world that feels corrupt at times, that feels captured, that feels assailing to our senses, and try to figure out which part of us is having that dance with the world that it feels that way? How do we fix and set the things right within ourselves to be able to engage with and impact something? And I think the biggest thing people are missing right now is a sense of meaning and a sense of community. And my hope for the Orphan X series is that it's both things. It's community in that, one book comes out a year. Everyone reads the same book. There's not 1,000 different AI books that you get to choose your own ending. And a lot of what he's trying to do is to strive through an imperfect past that's filled with, enough sin and regret to sink a normal person, to try to keep forging forward and to reclaim himself one mosaic piece at a time through these missions and through these stories.
Love that. Our last question comes from Rob. When Evan's condo was blown up, did you consider him moving somewhere else, a different area, or even a single family house, or considering his wealth an estate?
I sure did. I absolutely did. In my head, I was like, should I just have him build out a warehouse? I had him go stay. I made an allusion to it. I was going to write a scene, but I just made an allusion to him like sleeping in Tommy's, and Tommy's place is such a mess, he can't stand it, and there's like moonshine in the bathtub, and like they're like the worst odd couple ever, while his place is being rebuilt for 2 nights. But one of the things that occurred to me was it sort of defeats the purpose, because Evan is a big archetypal character, like Bond, like Bourne, like Reacher, but we see him going home. We see him having the awkward conversation in front of the mail slots, or getting stuck in the HOA meeting where they're arguing about the height of the carpet pile for the lobby. He's put himself in some ways, he's hiding in plain sight as this ordinary person who's very easy to overlook. He's a salesman for international cleaning supplies, right? Which is a nice little metaphor for the kind of cleanup work that he does. But part of who he is he's there among people trying to figure out this sort of world. And he's always got his face up to the aquarium glass, and he's kind of looking in and seeing all these people living lives that he himself can never live. And him being among those people, and these people in particular, I realize is a very important part of the series. So I wound him back up there.
So that is it for our AMA. Thank you to everyone who tuned in on Facebook and Crowdcast, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. And it seems like we'll definitely be doing another one of these, because there are a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to, but all of the questions that you all submitted were fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And thank you, Haley, for helping moderate.